Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fifth session of the Thought Leadership for Systems Transformation Program 2022. We are very happy to have Dave Snowden as our guest teacher today. So we'll start by listening to Dave's reflections on the collective narrative we shared with him last week, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So with that, Dave, I'd like to welcome you.
Hi, glad to be back. Yeah. Okay. There's probably a few things which come out of general themes here, which is the individual v systemic, right? So quite a few people that I know have used Cynefin as a method of doing individual change. It wasn't really designed for that, and I'm always curious when people use it that way, and I probably don't use it that way, right? So there are three major frameworks within the Cynefin Pantheon. One is Cynefin itself, which is what type of decisions can you make and when. Okay? So I can see ways in which I would use that personally, but not sort of in the sense of the way people are asking questions. But other people are better at that than I am. The second one is the Flexus Curves framework, which says in the context of everything else which is going on around you, whether it's government, ideas, politics, or markets, what's possible for you to do at various times. Right? So there's times when you can innovate and times when you can't, right? And there's no point in wasting energy. And the third one is the Estuarine Framework, which is the new one, which is really doing very well, actually. I've just run big workshops on it, which have been very successful. And that's trying to use the metaphor of an estuary. Right? I got quite antagonistic towards constructional law and people who kept focusing on flow. So they thought everything should flow in one direction, which, by the way, on things like is a real problem on political change. It's the Enlightenment myth of progress. Right? So I started talking about an estuary because in an estuary, the tide goes in and the tide goes out. Yeah, and there's things you can do at the balance of the tides that you can't do otherwise. Yeah, estuaries have granite cliffs, which you ain't going to be able to change, but you don't have to survey more than once every 20 years. And they have sandbanks where you have to survey them continuously, and you either have local guides or you put the energy into dredge and buoy a channel in order that people can come through. You see where I'm going with this? And a lot of the things you have to work out from the surface tension. So I've actually got maps all over my floor at the moment because we're working on a digital version of an Estuarine framework. So we can show to an organization what's possible at the current time and how it's actually changing and becoming fluid. So if I'm quite honest, my work focuses on organizational change and strategy and focus and far less on the personal, yeah. Which is not to say we ignore the personal, but I think it's more about creating, and I'll say something very negative about something some of you may like in a minute, and I refuse to apologize for doing this because I think it needs to be done, right? It's far more about changing the processes that people go through in the context in which people work, rather than trying to change the individual. So one of the terms I really hate is the concept of the mindset. Right? I mean, it's really bad science, all right? And I understand I use the term from time to time. It's a terribly tempting term, but it's used to put blame on individuals. So we had this big agile initiative, we all agreed it was going to be wonderful. We set it up, we had a vision, everybody bought into it. Now it hasn't worked. Oh, it must be the mindset of the employees, which is wrong. Yeah. The reality is that actually it very rarely is. So I would see mindset, for example, I'd look at three things, not one thing. First of all, mindset biases towards the cognitive, and that's only part of human consciousness. Human consciousness is distributed. So we talk about agency, affordance, and assemblage. So what you need to understand is who had agency in the system or what had agency in the system. Yeah. And if the process, if you adopted Agile, you may have removed agency for people because you've chosen one framework or one method of doing it. So you may have reduced agency rather than increasing it. We can talk more about that later if you want. We also talk heavily about distributed decision-making, not delegated decision-making. And there is a really important difference between the two. Then you move into affordances. So that comes from evolutionary biology. So what does the environment tell you is possible? There's no point in being the best person in the world in climbing trees if you live in a desert. Yeah, the affordances of the environment don't allow you to exercise the skill. Yeah. So mapping affordances, that's part of what Estuarine is about, is what does the system enable you to do in the current context? And then we get assemblage. This is a reference to Deleuze, right? So what are the basic patterns of narrative, the tropes, the narrative patterns of the past and the present in our history, which frame the way we see the world? Right? So if you stop talking about mindset change and you talk about affordance, assemblage, and agency, it's a much more practical way of looking at the problem. And part of the issues we got, and there's this big conference coming up. This is where, if I upset people, I do not apologize, right? Where you've got Otto Scharmüller, Peter Senge, all of these people coming together to create, they've got the international development goals. And what do they call it now? They now want all of these to be internalized. And you've got people saying things like, it's nothing to do with the science anymore. If we just change how people feel about the planet, then magically global warming will go away. Right? You've got the Game B nonsense from the States, which regrettably has got my name on it without my agreement, right? Which is, let's create these idealized future spaces and talk about how things should be. And that makes us feel really good about ourselves, but then nothing changes. And this stuff is just lotus eating, right? And if you don't know this, there's a huge amount of, for some of the far right libertarian funding is going into new age groups at the moment, because new age groups actually distract people from engaging with social reality, right? In terms of the way they work. So you can see, sorry, I work with some interesting people from time to time. So I'm responding to several of the points made in the group, that this is not about, and also this is also important, individuals live in a social network of connections. They're not entire unto themselves. And the Northern European, North American obsession with the individual is part of the problem. Yeah, it's actually very easy to change people if you change who they interact with, and it's more ethical. Right? The idea that you can define competencies or capabilities or what sort of people we want, I don't think is ethical. I think is actually very dangerous. It's a sort of form of colonialism in many ways. But I can legitimately change interactions and processes and how things work so that people see things in different ways. Right? So I'll give you the peace and reconciliation example here. So, and two ones on this. So I was working in Northern Ireland on peace and reconciliation in the 70s, which was an interesting place to be. I mean, I was going to be a Jesuit then, so I was sort of on the Catholic side. And I still remember getting picked up by the police, all right? This is the state, right? But they're all Protestant. I got picked up by an RUC Land Rover in Derry and asked which of my legs did I want broken first. And then they heard my accent and realized I was a mainland Catholic, not an Irish Catholic. And therefore, if they broke my legs, they might get into trouble. So I got thrown out of the Land Rover, yeah? Now, if the Provo commander had come around that night, I'd have probably joined and I wouldn't be here now, right? Because I was so angry about that, in terms of the way it worked. And that wasn't down to evil people, because they were probably really nice to their grandchildren. It was a systematic issue or problem. And what then happened is people of goodwill decided the way to solve the problem in Northern Ireland was to get all these people together in big workshops and discover all the things they had in common and agree that they would be nice to each other and stop throwing petrol bombs at each other. That was called Coromila. Got a huge amount of money, but it was very attractive. If anybody hasn't seen Derry Girls, go and watch it, because in episode 1 of series 2, this is brilliantly satirized, in which the Catholic girls are forced into a peace and reconciliation process with the Protestant boys, led by a trendy police facilitated by cynical nuns. All right. So if you haven't seen that, it really is worth watching, and I'll put the link in. Yeah, you can get that. Yeah, so that's in the chat line. Yeah. We took a different approach. We took a couple of Catholics and a Protestant, or a couple of Protestants and a Catholic, small group asymmetry, and we dumped them into Latin America for 6 months, and we didn't talk about the Troubles. And they discovered pretty damn fast they had more in common than they realized. And then they had a conversation about their differences when they were ready to have it, not when some liberal facilitator wanted to be there to see them agree that they should act differently. Yeah. Far too much organizational change is what I call the Billy Graham school of change. If anybody doesn't remember Billy Graham and the evangelical rallies, in which you have to go to the mercy seat and confess your sins and then be taken behind the stage to be, you know the sort of thing I'm talking about, right? So one response to a lot of the comments is we really need to focus on how people interact and the processes in which people live, and much less on individuals, right? Which is not to say there isn't an extensive role for coaching. We're just launching a whole new Gemba system for coaches. But coaching is a personal choice of who you interact with and who helps you work through things in your life. And far too much in organizational change comes sideways from therapy. Yeah, or from adult development theories. And by the way, that's the other thing Nora Bateson and I dislike. I think when she says adult behavioral models are eugenics, I sort of agree, though I wouldn't be quite that extreme, but I think she's on the side of the righteous there, right? And the whole point about this is that I, the expert, will say that you haven't got the right level of maturity and I'll help you achieve it. Yeah. Or the organization needs therapy. I'm a therapist. Yeah. I will come in and give it. The reality is it's probably you or the people who brought you in who need the therapy. So for me, that sort of individual thing is a personal choice issue. The responsibility of the organization is to make sure that the processes, the structures, and the interactions aren't toxic. And that's where we focus on things like distributed leadership, distributed decision-making, cross-silo working. And the stuff we're doing on nudges at the moment, for example, I think behavioral economics, sorry, I'm in a bad mood. Behavioral economics is one of the most evil things that humankind have ever created, right? It's deeply manipulative. The good news is it's not very effective once people realize what's going on, right? We focus instead on what we call micro-nudging. So for example, I'll present a description of a situation to different groups of people, get them all to interpret it, and then show them the maps of the way they differ. So we've been doing this on a big European Union project. We're about to launch this, by which you come on what's called a meaning wall. So you see a wall of stories and pictures which have been generated by people in your community or your organization. The ones which interest you, you click on, and then you get to interpret those stories, and then you get shown how the people who created them interpreted them, and how other people have interpreted them, and then you reflect on that, right? So what we're doing is to create a mechanism for micro-nudging, but critically, you nudge yourself. You're not nudged by somebody outside. You encounter differences. You went through a process, everybody else went through that process, so you can't change the results. They saw it like this, we saw it like that. Yeah. So a lot of the stuff in the things was, I've really been saying, how do we work with groups or culture and change in an ethical way? Yeah. And really challenging some of the sort of ideas that it's about changing the individuals. Yeah. Sorry, I'm a Catholic, not a Protestant. I'm a socialist, not a capitalist. All right. So to me, it's the system that matters rather than the individuals. Yeah, it's not individuals don't matter, but change is achieved by changing systems and interactions. So that would be one set of comment. Dealing with the climate crisis, well, that's what we've just been talked about. We launched an initiative some time ago. You are not going to get any government to implement the Paris Accord on a consistent, scalable, worldwide basis if they think they're not going to get elected in the next election. And regrettably, human beings are short-term focused, not long-term focused. We all cooperated on COVID because there was an immediate threat, but the threat of climate change against aircraft, flying too many aircraft is a bigger threat to climate change than it was to the spread of COVID. But we were prepared not to travel for COVID, but we're not prepared not to travel for climate change because it's an immediate and proximate effect, not something else. So if you want to change this, and there's a wonderful book by Terry Eagleton that I recommend people read. Well, all of Terry's books are brilliant. How he produces so many, I don't know, called Radical Sacrifice. Yeah. And what you've got to do is to get people making local sacrifices so that they can understand the wider picture before nations and governments can make bigger sacrifices. Now, the good news is you've only got to get about a 5 or 10% change for the overall dispositional state to shift. But until you get lots of small sacrifices at a local level and lots of small awareness, you don't create what's called a substrate, which will allow politicians to make the changes at a national level. Because there's no point in a political party doing the right thing just to be voted out of office 2 years later and the whole thing be reversed. Okay? So people aren't thinking like that, right? So what Cynefin does is to say this is a complex problem, it's not an ordered problem, right? If it's a complex problem, stop saying how things should be. That doesn't work in complexity, end of argument. Yeah? Map the constraints. We have a whole typology for this, we have a whole process. Once you've mapped the constraints, place the constraints on a grid. We use energy cost of change against time to change. So if things are high energy cost to change, high time to change, they're called a counterfactual. They ain't going to change anytime soon. If things are low cost of change, low time to change, then they're more threat than they are opportunity. And the space between two of those lines is effectively the field in which you can engage. Okay? And then you start to change the constraints to see if you can produce better results. Right? So what you're doing is you're managing what we call the evolutionary potential of the present. And it doesn't matter whether you're working at an organizational level or a national level. Yeah, there's no point in knocking your head against a brick wall with things which would take too much energy or time to change. You need to work out where that space is. Yeah? Quite interestingly, one of the fascinating things we found is that when we got people to mount counterfactuals, they suddenly realized that they can change them. It's interesting, when they put them into that boundary, they start to say, well, actually, we could do this or we could do that. So it seems to engender wider data. And we've been doing it for 3 months now. We get about 4 to 5 times the amount of data out of constraint mapping than we do out of brainstorming. Yeah, and I think what happens is, I mean, this is ironic, the constraint typology acts as what's called an enabling constraint, yeah, which triggers people to think divergently. So that's actually working quite well. And that's what I would start to do. In the area in which I'm competent, what are the constraints? What can I do to change those constraints? Right, go and do it. And enough people do that at a hyperlocal level, then the overall situation will change. The good and bad news is that I suspect within my lifetime, all right, and I'm 68 now, I'm still able to walk 20 miles in a day, so I'm feeling younger than that. But in my lifetime, I think we'll see a sizable portion of India and most of Indonesia uninhabitable, unless you're in air conditioning. Right? There's kind of like no way we're going to avoid that. Right? I'm part of I actually have to vote every week on whether we think Putin is bluffing about nuclear weapons and whether NATO needs to do a massive surgical strike before Putin goes to other countries but Ukraine. And I should say the vote is going in that favor at the moment, particularly for those of us who actually know something about the history of the Weimar Republic, yeah, in terms of what you have to do. Now, we're in a world which is about to actually suffer catastrophic failure and major change. The good news is that will get people's attention. Right? And this is what I was talking about in the podcast previously. We need to stop having preachy meetings and talking about what everybody else should do. And we need to do some things ourselves to make a difference, but we also need to start to create a system which can respond when the catastrophes start to make other people aware of the need. And this is sort of anticipatory thinking in terms of the way things work. So that would be kind of like the other aspect on this in terms of the way things work. I think I've done most of the things there. If I've missed something, please tell me. Yeah. Oh, most common mistakes in understanding Cynefin domains. First of all, people think chaos is a state. It isn't, it's a temporary state. I think this is particularly prone in the agile community. They can't cope with any model with different spaces and not have even numbers of things in all the spaces. Yeah. So, you see people say traffic in Mumbai is chaotic. It's not chaotic. I've been to Mumbai. If you walk in a straight line at a constant pace across any road in Mumbai, you're safe, right? Because it's a complex, highly adaptive system, right? It's not chaotic, it's complex adaptive, right? So chaos is a state of no effective constraint, and that's rare. Human beings do not like a lack of constraint. So we impose it pretty damn fast. The secret in the chaotic domain is to realize you're there before other people realize it for you. Part of the issue for senior people is they're so immunized from what's actually going on that they don't know how chaotic it is until it's too late. And it sort of comes out and bites you. So that's a common mistake, right? Chaos is temporary or transitional. The other is making the states more desirable than the others. Again, this is an agile disease. Agile is a complex technique. Waterfall is an ordered technique. Now, first of all, agile isn't a complex technique. Most agile methods are complex to complicated transition techniques. But even if it was true, that doesn't make agile better than waterfall. It just means in complex it would be better, but in order it would be disaster. The whole point about Cynefin is to say different things work in different spaces, and no domain is better than another domain. And some work better for some things and some work better for others. So it's kind of like a multi-situational stuff. And so that's why if you read the EU Field Guide, I presume everybody's seen that now. Yeah. Right. So you can get paper copies of this now. If you live in the European Union, they'll be posted to you for free. If you live anywhere else in the world, you'll have to pay for postage. So regrettably, because of the bloody English, sorry, we blame the English for everything in Wales. You'll have to pay postage if you live in the UK, right? Now, that actually contains a lot of this stuff. It contains the concept of human sensor networks, but it also contains this whole process about how you manage complexity. And the key thing it says is start in the central domain of Cynefin, the one everybody forgets about, but is actually the most important, which is the aporetic domain, the domain of unanswerable questions that make you think differently. Okay? And that's kind of like where people should start. Yeah? And so now I think I've covered everything that was said in that document, or at least everything in my notes about what was said in that document, including my daughter's comments, because she was with me on the train yesterday and went through it as well. And she's the company's lead anthropologist, so I pay attention.
Thank you so much, Dave. And now it's time for the Q&A section, and I see that there are some questions in the chat. Ben, would you like to ask a question?
Sure, thank you. My question is, what connections and distinctions do you see between working at the organizational scale and at larger scales, such as the community, well, in some sense larger, but community scale or the scale of a bioregion or other systemic scales? And also related to that, is there possibly a parallel between the limits of working towards individual change and the limits of working towards organizational change of the value of that, to the extent that organizations are comparable to individuals within larger systems?
Okay, so a couple of comments on that. Yeah. I think the distinction between organizations and societies, if it was ever real, is breaking down. Organizations exist in the context of the society in which they were born. Yeah. But there's some quite interesting developments at the moment. I mean, the US I wish I was an alien watching what's happening in the US with no consequences to me, right? But if you look, Disney taking on Florida is really interesting, right? Because Disney Corporation aren't prepared to tolerate intolerance of LGBT or gender diversity, whereas the Florida government thinks they should. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of us have been saying for a long time that one person, one vote democracy does not work in a resource constrained world. Yeah, and that kind of like validates that in many ways. So this intersection between state and company and organization is really starting to break down, and I think will break down more. So we talk about fractal engagement. Remember I talked about affordances? Well, society provides affordances and it provides assemblages which determine agency within the system. And we're about to have a battle between Disney and Florida about who has the most agency. there's a more depressing battle with Musk about to happen, which, and just to say this, all right, libertarian funding is really scary at the moment. Yeah, if you look at it, so it turns out most of the research money into Santa Fe is coming from libertarian sources. For those of us in complexity theory, that's deeply worrying. Yeah, as I say, the funding of extreme new age groups, because it's a distraction. So I say the question of who has agency in our modern society is becoming really interesting. You know, the evidence coming out on just how close we came to a coup a year or so ago. All right, and what's going to happen when, you know, you've got a Democratic president with both houses governed by extreme Republicans prepared to manipulate the vote? I mean, there's no orthodoxy left. That's before we get on to our particular Boris buffoon, but that's another matter, right? I think we decided that there was no point in the States having Trump if we didn't produce something worse, so we went out to do it, all right? So I think all of this stuff is up for grabs at the moment, and it's hugely flexible, and we don't know what's going to happen, and it's all integrated and there's no separation. Then I'll go on. I think the metaphor of a person to an organization is a really bad metaphor. You find it in Senge, you find it in a lot of systems thinking. You know, the idea that, you know, that you've got the brain, the body. The model of an individual which people use is a Cartesian model of consciousness. It's not a modern model of consciousness. You know, we know that consciousness is a distributed function of the body, the brain, and its social interactions. It's not co-located with the brain. So the metaphor breaks down anyway, yeah, in terms of the way it works. But also an individual is effectively a closed system, whereas a society is an open system. So you can't use the metaphor of a closed system on an open system without things going badly wrong. Yeah. So I wouldn't use that metaphor. If you want somebody who's even more savage about it than me, go and read Manuel de Landa. He goes for this big time, and quite rightly, I think. And by the way, if you haven't, I mean, sorry, I'm going from other calls. One of the big things a lot of us are talking about now is the whole concept of modernism and postmodernism. Socialist and capitalist are irrelevant concepts in the modern world. Yeah, those are 20th century divides, right? If you're in philosophy at the moment, the really interesting stuff, and I would number myself against these people, are the new materialists, who are people like de Landa bringing on, you know, and interestingly, the new materialism is coming from continental philosophy, not British or American. Yeah, there's a greater affinity between Deleuze and Derrida and modern science than there is with sort of Anglo-Saxon philosophy. Yeah, so what you're starting to see is that sort of trend is starting to come through. The other big strand going into new materialism is gender studies, feminism, and post-colonialism, which is basically saying the world is real and it's material and it impacts on us, and we've got to recognize that materiality. Right, and I think that's where we are now. And I think, as I keep, you know, famous phrase on postmodernism doesn't give a flying duck, all right? Postmodernism is responsible for Trump. Yeah, if like Rorty, you say all views are equally valid, they're all culturally determined, well, sorry, that means all views are equally valid, not just the ones that agree with you.
Yeah, I'm super interested when you say constraints. There's no real Swedish word for it, but what is the study of constraints? What does it really mean, and who is the people who can navigate the constraint space, if there is such a thing? And okay. How do you transform the learning of that activity as well, changing the constraints?
Okay, so there's a couple of things here. One is Alicia Gerraro is about to publish a new book entirely on constraints, right, which is going to be out in the fall, which is going to be really worth looking for. That picks up on some of the issues about scaffolding, and a lot of us have been concerned that when people talk about scaffolding, they assume it means big metal things that you take away once you built the building. Whereas if you look at the biological approach on scaffolding, it's things like how an endoskeleton allows for diversity while providing coherent structures. So an endoskeleton is a type of constraint, which means you get consistency, but with variety, right? So there's a whole typology of constraints. One of the things I invented, which has been picked up a lot, is the concept of dark constraints, which is a reference to dark energy in cosmology, So there are system effects that we can see, but we don't know what's triggering them. Yeah? And on sideline on this, if you don't know, one of the really interesting things coming out of modern physics, apart from constructor theory, is the idea that information may have mass. And if information has mass, that explains dark energy, and it means that information also has momentum, and that explains a lot. So I'm playing around with that at the moment, all right? So there's a whole body of stuff on constraints that you'll find in the biological literature and elsewhere. That the type of constraints I would own, the danger on constraints is that everybody thinks about Goldratt and theory of constraints. And then they think constraints are things to remove. Yeah. So in order to get better flow, you remove constraints. Well, the reality is if you have a system without constraints, everything is equiprobable, so no change happens anyway. Yeah, and often you use constraints to improve flow. So if you look at the simulations on people escaping from a fire in the hall, if you put a barrier in front of the door, flow is faster than if you don't have a barrier. Yeah. So constraints is a hugely important, it's the only thing we can actually manage in a complex system with the constraints. Yeah. And so mapping constraints also gets around the classic problem you have in strategy, that no human being can make an objective assessment of a situation because we all have a subconscious hypothesis about what we think we should do. All right. And therefore we assess the situation based on that. So, you know, we're naturalizing sense making. So we take that as a reality. So we map constraints and we do this. I mean, I'll give it, we're about to start one, for example, with AstraZeneca, right? It's not confidential. We're doing it. What we're doing is probably confidential. So we're using SenseMaker in its Gemba form to generate constraints or knowledge of constraints from the entire population of AstraZeneca over 2 or 3 weeks at a micro level. And then we're clustering and grouping those to produce a constraint map, which will then be broken into energy cost of change, time to change. That will define the counterfactual space of things which ain't going to change, or if they're going to change, we can't look at them for another 6 months or 9 months. It will create the space in which we can operate. And then we'll look at which constraints act in as what are called constructors. If anybody wants the big paper on this, if you haven't seen it, and just to tell you, this is a very academic paper, that's just been published. Yeah. So what a constructor is it's something which produces a replicable result. So a machine is a constructor. In human beings, a ritual is a constructor. All right, or a habit is a constructor. It produces replicable results. The difference I've got with Deutscher and with Kahler on constructor theory and physics is I think human constructors can change. They don't remain unchanged in the act of construction. Yeah? So you map what the constructors are and how stable they are, and then you identify where you have white spaces, and then you do safe to fail experiments to generate constructors. And that's what's called the Estuarine Framework. Because what you want is things which produce consistent, manageable results. You want to know the boundary conditions. You want real-time feedback loops so that you can actually do lots of small interventions to steer the direction or the evolution of the system rather than these idealistic endpoints. Yeah, and that's, I'm quite excited by this, to be honest. I think, you know, Cynefin was big when I did that. This is actually potentially even bigger, yeah, in terms of what it does, in terms of making complexity-based strategy completely different. And I say, I'm now running this. We launched it 3 months ago, and I'm now working with 3 pharmaceutical companies at board level using it. They all came independently, all right? And farmers tend to be the early adopters. And for those interested, you haven't seen it, we just launched the kits. Yeah. So we're taking all of our methods and tools and third-party tools and processes and putting them into simple facilitation things that can be used virtually and physically with QR codes to link them to source material. And the principle there is that you start by saying, what are we currently doing? So you pick the hexes that you're currently using, put them in sequence. Then you say, what can we change? So it's this key complexity principle. You scale by decomposition and recombination, not by imitation or repetition. So what we're now starting to do is to build a capability to look at what are the coherent components of a system, map those, and then identify which can be changed, and some changes just to link them differently, yeah, or connect them differently, and then get the feedback loops, which will allow you to see how the system is evolving. And that means, and some of you have heard this before, we call this the Frozen 2 strategy, all right? So has everybody seen Frozen 2? No? You haven't seen, oh, go watch it, right? It's a brilliant movie, right? You have to sit through Frozen 1 to understand Frozen 2, but Frozen 1 is a dire movie. It's a bunch of stereotypes. It's a classic Disney movie, but it was so successful, yeah, that they had good script writers on the second one rather than the bad script writers they had on the first, yeah. And it's a great complexity movie, and it's written for adults as well as children. Right? I mean, and really good children. It's like Harry Potter. You can understand it at different levels and Tolkien, right? In the middle of Frozen 2, the real heroine of the Frozen series, who isn't the sister with the magic, it's the sister without the magic, right? And she's suddenly left on her own. She thinks her sister is dead, a guide is dead, she's on her own in a dark place, and she sings this wonderful song, which actually has now become famous in the context of Ukraine, which is, all I can do is do the next right thing. Right? Now in complexity, that's called an adjacent possible. So what's really important is you know where you are, you know where you can go next, and ideally you do that in multiple ways in parallel, and then you look again. Right? And that's actually what we mean by complexity strategy. You manage the evolutionary potential of the present, and you stop talking about how things should be, and you deal with how things are. And I'm not a Disney fan. Well, when I was 4, I saw Bambi, and I was deeply traumatized by Bambi at the age of 4. I mean, that was a terribly dark movie, all right? I mean, I was taken to it as a treat, right? And it was, oh my God, I didn't sleep for night, right? So Disney is weird, because when it's good, it's very, very bad good, and when it's bad, it's awful. The language of stories, children's stories, is quite interesting. And it comes across. So one of the things that we know in sociology is a thing called the Woozle Effect. So when you look at these cards, you'll find we're printing cards for things like the Woozle Effect, right? Yeah, and inattentional blindness. And the Woozle Effect comes from Winnie the Pooh. And by the way, Disney should be wiped from the face of the planet for what they did to Winnie the Pooh. All right, it was absolutely, utterly appalling. All right, so I would not watch that on principle, right? And there's a wonderful in Winnie the Pooh, where Winnie the Pooh wakes up one morning and he goes for a walk around the wood, yeah, and there's snow on the ground, and he comes back and he sees his own footprints, but he thinks they're a strange creature, which he calls a woozle. So he walks around to try and find the woozle and comes back, and now there are 2 sets of footprints, so now there are 2 woozles. And then Piglet joins him, and they both walk around the tree, so now there are 3 woozles and 1, shall we say, whizzle. Yeah, and everybody gets scared, and then Christopher Robin intervenes. Now in sociology, that's called the Woozle Effect. So somebody writes a paper, somebody else references the paper, and everybody follows the track, and nobody really thinks about what's going on. Yeah.
I'm really, I'm a theologian, and I work a lot with chaos and rest, or action and rest. And, I'm just curious. I love your chaos idea. But in the mystery, in the dark, when we go silent within ourselves, that dark place, when you're looking at constraints, there's things that bubble up. So I'm just curious around action and rest, because I feel like when I rest into the organization and let it move itself, it moves in its own mysterious way that is much better than what I could think of myself, And I think this is where I've been really blessed to let myself sit in it,
I mean, there's different things here. I mean, I had the great privilege of studying under Karl Rahner back in the 70s. If you don't know, Rahner was the Jesuit philosopher behind Vatican II, yeah? And also briefly under Lohengrin and other people. So say I was a Jesuit in training. I got summoned to the Vatican for heresy by Ratzinger. So I'm probably the only person on this group to have seen the Sistine Chapel in the bad way, all right? Because I'd written a paper which said Marxism, Catholicism, and Hinduism were ontologically compatible, so could be combined. and Protestantism and capitalism were ontologically incompatible, so were heresies, all right? So either way, that got me into trouble, and that's another story, all right? I think we need to be careful on this. I think if you look at the Catholic tradition in the orders do different things. You know, so you've got contemplative orders, you've got teaching orders, you've got the friars, you've got the Jesuits, who are different anyway, right? And they all represent different functions. So there's a space for contemplation, there's a space for that reflection, there's a space for seeing the spaces. And I still teach meditation, and I still go on retreats whenever I can, right? But if you go back, and it's worth looking at the literature on liberation theology, and sorry, this is going back to my roots, all right? So Guterresi and all those people, yeah? It's prayer through action, all right, not withdrawal. And I remember, with the exception of the Mennonites back in the 70s, we couldn't get the Protestants to engage in social action because they were really focused on converting people to their particular brand of Christianity. And we were on the other side of that completely, right? And I think that tradition continues, right? So what I'm arguing against is not the value of meditation, the value of reflection, the value of discovering those spaces. What I'm arguing against is the attempt to impose it on people when it suits some people in some communities, but others need, you know, some of us are teachers, some of us are friars and mendicants and so on. And that's where I go, all right? The other thing, which if you're into this, Terry Eagleton, if you don't know, he and I were, along with Herbert McCabe, editors of a Catholic Marxist magazine called Slant, back in the 70s, all right? And Terry wrote another book which took up Moltmann's Theology of Hope, and he's just written an update. Terry wrote a book about, which is called Hope Without Optimism. Because in the Christian tradition, to give up on hope is a mortal sin. But that doesn't mean you have to be optimistic. Right? And I think that's actually a really important concept. He's written that for a secular audience, but that's worth picking up. And just to amuse you, a woman in our cabinet office who was what we call a secret squirrel. You know what secret squirrels are? Okay, it's our name for our intelligence services. They hide their nuts. So they're called secret squirrels, right? And they all meet at a cafe in Hyde Park. If you want to meet our intelligence community, just go to that cafe. They're all there having meetings, yeah, in terms of the way it works. So this woman is working with that, and she phoned me up and she wrote a brilliant paper on, she used Cynefin to understand the role of religion in the Bush White House. Yeah, published paper, it's on our website. It's really interesting because that's our government working out what religion is doing using Cynefin, right? And she phoned me up, and I've never forgotten this. And she said, this paper is heavily influenced by Rana, isn't it? And nobody else has spotted that before. Yeah. So that was fascinating. Sorry, don't get me onto theology.
When there is a war happening, many of us are thinking about the role of violence and change, or the relationship between violence and change. And normally we try to minimize violence or eliminate violence and try to avoid violence. And when a situation becomes violent around us, there is some confusion sometimes among those people who just want to come and talk and like each other and all that. So I wonder what you think about the relationship between violence and change, and specifically what it can tell us as systems change students, I would say.
Okay, so you need to know that I teach from time to time just war theory at West Point. Because the only people, I mean, and just to tell you, they are the brightest students I've taught. I mean, West Point has some very, very bright people, and they genuinely worry about killing people because they're going to have to do it. They have a much more stronger ethical sense than I've seen most in government because of the reality of what they're going to face. All right. And it was interesting. I mean, one of the reasons I did it is only those of us who are Catholic Marxists in the 70s know about just war theory, because we had to justify, you know, shooting the capitalists come the revolution. So we went back to Aquinas and developed the theory, right? And I still buy that. I'm not a pacifist. I don't think it's practical to be a pacifist, all right? I mean, it's a legitimate response at times, but other times it isn't. The thing just war theory did in the Middle Ages, it inhibited the extremes of war. Right? Now, if you look what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment, the inhibitions aren't present. Right? And the question for the NATO countries is how long will we permit racial genocide? Right? And people aren't getting this. They don't understand the concept of Rus, which is driving this. Yeah, and you know, India is the main danger to this, not China, because India is more important to Russia in that sense. But if you isolate Putin more, it's going to get worse. All right. I mean, we really need Finland to join NATO fast, because that's another target, right? And the threat of nuclear war and nuclear weapons will allow, I mean, so this is personal, right? I think that is going to extend. I think the longer we leave it, the worse it's going to get. Yeah. And I think the fact that all the inhibitions of warfare, the genocide, the mass graves, what we now know is pre-organized rape, right? Pre-organized rape, predetermined rape, right? That we can't tolerate that as a society and live with ourselves when we can do something about it. Right? So I think that's where we are at the moment on that, right? And I mean, if anybody wants to know more on the peace building work, I've just accepted a sort of partial position at the Carter Center in in GMU. So I gave the first lecture on that. That is available online if anybody wants it. And it talks about a very different approach to peace and reconciliation than the sort of high-level mediation, sitting down, talking about things. Yeah, just to be amusing, this is a standard question, all right? Does anybody know which religious order was responsible for burning most people during the Counter-Reformation? The cruelest, most vicious of all the religious orders. Anybody know which one it was? It was the Franciscans.
Jesuits?
Franciscans. Jesuits didn't do that sort of thing. Jesuits influenced power, right? Jesuits are deeply manipulative individuals, and you can see that coming through in me, right? That was the Franciscans. Yeah, I mean, they knew they were right. So, yeah. The Dominicans were a close second, but Franciscans were first.
Thank you, Dave, for the wonderful discussion, and also to the rest of the group. Now it's time for closing remarks. Dave, what do you want to leave us with?
Oh, I think the principle of starting where people are, not where you want them to be, is a really important one. Right? And if you look at what's actually happening, I mean, for my many and various sins, I had to read Trump's tweets every morning for 4 years for a project I was doing with MIT. And I've subsequently suffered extreme withdrawal symptoms from the righteous indignation which followed for the hour after we had the conference call every morning. But what Trump did brilliantly was to use key phrases to trigger what we call tropes or assemblages or strange attractors. Yeah. And every time people proved he was wrong, they made it worse, not better. Yeah. I had a big debate on this recently with people I'm working with in the Democratic Party and saying, it's not about better information. And the Georgia people back me up. I said, you've got to get on the streets and interact with people and create empathy and talk with people. That's the only way you beat the far right. You don't beat it by information warfare, right? Because you need to be where people are. And I'll tell a story to illustrate this. So when I was 11, all right, I won the primary school mock election. In those days, when there was an election in Britain, all the schools had a mock election and you stood as a candidate and you presented it and the school voted. And I won it for the Labour Party, and my mother would have killed me if I hadn't, because she was Labour Party organiser for the whole of North Wales. And to be fair, I didn't know till afterwards she organised the parents to lobby the children to make sure that the vote came out the right way. We're Welsh, we do this sort of stuff, all right? And so, yeah, this woman called Mrs. E.M.C. Davis, and you only ever called her Mrs. E.M.C. Davis until you got to know her intimately, and then you could call her EMC. And Wales is a matriarchy. She was a matriarch, right? And she was a councillor for a working class constituency. And she was also what we call in the UK a magistrate or an elected judge. Yeah. And she sent most of the people who voted for her to prison on a regular basis. But they still voted for her because she was fair about it and she made sure their families were looked after while they were in jail. All right. And she just controlled that part of the Labour Party, right? So she decided I obviously had potential to be a politician. So she said I was to be taken out for tea, right? Now, if anybody's seen June, the movie, And my mother was nervous about this, and I realized this was a gom jabber ceremony, all right? It was, you know, I was going out for tea with Miss MC Davis. There were multiple consequences on this, yeah? And I still remember what she said to me. She said, the reason they vote for us is because we care about them and we do things for them to look after them. They do not believe in our ideology. And the day you forget that is the day we lose. And that's what happened to the Democratic Party in the States and the Labour Party in the UK. They forgot their role was to engage in communities, not to actually support an ideology. The right will always win that sort of battle. And whether it's organizational change or society change, it's deep engagement. It's not ideological idealism, which will make a difference.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everyone.